As the cliche goes, we interrupt our normal viewing to bring you this special broadcast. Yes, this is still a daily video, but I wanted to address a comment that came in on yesterday's daily video. Yesterday's daily video was about using buckets, with bucket and the entile function to do histograms in the Oracle database using SQL. And the first comment that came in struck a bit of a nerve, mainly because I'm a bit of a SQL bigot. And the comment was, well, I don't use SQL nowadays. I have an ORM, the ORM does the SQL for me. As a developer, it's been years since I last had to even touch SQL, so why bother doing videos about it? So I wanted to address that. I view this as being a bit similar to the natural key versus surrogate key discussion I was having a while back, in that people tend to think that these things are mutually exclusive. I am biased toward SQL, but that doesn't mean that I should never use an ORM, and I think the opposite argument holds true as well. Just because you're familiar with an ORM doesn't mean you should use SQL. Don't get me wrong, we all have our natural biases. Because I was brought up and pretty much lived my life writing SQL, I'll often use SQL places where maybe you could make an argument that it's not the best solution. But I think that whole thing flows into the fact that to say something like you shouldn't use SQL and should you only use an ORM, or vice versa for that matter, really doesn't make a lot of sense. What happens when we're building applications nowadays is the make or break for an application is generally not going to be the technology. What's going to be is the skill set of the team you're in. If you've got a team that is super skilled at SQL Server, then I probably wouldn't recommend that they jump out and use Oracle for their next project. And vice versa for that matter. If I had a team that was super skilled in Python, then coming along with an edict saying, well, I read somewhere on the internet that Java's the best language, we're going to do everything in Java, once again, probably doesn't make for a very successful application. By and large, more than anything else, the skill set of your team that's going to build the applications, is pretty much going to drive the capability of that application being a success. That's what brings me back to the original comment that if I'm using an ORM, I don't need to use SQL. I think that's not a great idea. If I've got a very SQL-centric skilled team, I'm going to maximize those skills. If I've got an ORM skilled team, I'm probably going to maximize those skills as well. But the key thing is I'm making decisions based on skill sets as opposed to some religious war about why I need an ORM or why I don't need an ORM. Most obvious example of that is even the person that invented Hibernate said it was a facility to build upon and augment SQL, not replace it. And I think that's a very valid argument. We use skills and technologies that best augment and make our applications succeed. For most projects, that's going to involve a combination of the two. Some SQL, some ORM, and the blend of which is going to be best defined by the skill set of your team. And that combination of skills translates directly into what I call the combination of features inside an application. Most applications have what I would consider, I'm just plucking these numbers out of thin air, a 70-30 split. The 70% is functionality that your application has to have simply to actually operate, but it actually doesn't define the competitive advantage of that application. The other 30% is the critical part. Let me explain with an example. If I was building a retail application, then there's pretty much only two core parts of the functionality that make or break my application. That is the facility which lets people see what they can buy from my website, and the act of actually purchasing it. They're the two things that people see day in, day out, and it's going to make all the difference on their decision making or whether to come back to your website over and over again. But that's only a tiny percent of the application that you need to build. There's a whole stack of other stuff you'll probably need to build that the public will never see. The screen that maintains the products, the screen that maintains the customers, the screen that maintains this, that, and the other. Some admin screens, those that define annual reports or report trends, etc. All sorts of stuff that has to go into your application because it needs to be built, but the public will never see. And if they're a bit flaky or they're a bit unrigorous, it's not really a big deal because they don't change the competitive aspects of your application. If I've got a team that's very skilled in ORM, why would I insist that they handcraft the SQL for those 70% functions? Similarly, if I have a team which is very skilled in SQL, why would I then insist, nope, you must use an ORM for those? For those 70% of parts of the application which no one ever sees but are an essential part of the application, why not just pick the skill set that's best to my team? For the remaining 30%, the wow factor parts, in those cases, I'm going to pick the technology that's going to best deliver the competitive advantage of that application. That might be an ORM, that might be SQL, it might be a blend of the two. My experience has been that more often than not, the things that have the wow factor nowadays are the things that are generally interrogating the data in your application. Why do people go to certain retail sites? Because it says, we know what you bought before, we know what other people are buying who have similar interests. It's all generally based in data. And if I'm churning through a lot of data, then generally I think SQL is going to be the better option compared to an ORM, because if you've got the SQL skills in-house, there's no better way of processing data than with SQL. It is the de facto data processing language. We have all heard the cliche, data is the new oil. Funny, that cliche breaks down because oil flows pretty easily. And I can tell you right now, if your data has to flow from the database server out to an ORM, that's expensive. Data doesn't flow as simply as oil does. So that's why SQL is often going to be the best choice when you're doing data intensive work for those wow parts of your application. That, of course, doesn't preclude the use of an ORM. It just says that for those particular examples, you might want to handcraft your SQL and then lay an ORM over the top of it. For example, you might use a view or other database-based technology in order to maximize the benefit of the SQL processing power, and then sit an ORM on top of it in order to do the object relational mapping for you. And even if there comes a point in time where an ORM generates SQL for you, that's perfect. Not knowing SQL, I still think, is a sad omission in a developer SQL set for this simple reason. What are the things getting all the traction nowadays? What's all the buzz and the excitement in the IT landscape? In fact, just the internet landscape. For starters, maybe a year ago, everyone was raving about GitHub Copilot, the ability to phrase something in natural language and have code spit out as a result. You simply nominated what you required that the functionality was going to be, and the functionality was written for you. And then, of course, the big one recently is ChatGPT. And it's really just an extension of that same concept. Namely, I want to be able to specify something in a natural language and have the result come out to me in something that's easily digestible, whether it's code or something else. But the objective here is I don't need to know the how and the why. I just need to nominate something in natural language and the tool will take care of it for me. When I think of that requirement, I find it strange that people then go and dismiss SQL out of hand, because SQL beat these tools to the punch by about 40 years. It has always been that same premise. You nominate in, well, almost what we call natural language. That's certainly more natural than basic code would be. You nominate in a natural language what your desired result is, and you don't care about the algorithm. You don't care how it's worked out. Some other tool, in this case the database and the database optimizer, does it for you. Therefore, to simply dismiss something like SQL out of hand, I think is missing out on probably what is the future of IT. Namely, that we will express ourselves in a more natural language, and the code, the SQL, the data processing, or anything else part of the developer's normal mindset will actually be taken care of us by a machine. So don't get me wrong, I'm not out here ORMs. What I am saying is, I think it's a naive view to assume that technology X, whatever X is, should be the sole technology you should use, and therefore you don't need to worry about technology Y, Z, etc. I think the landscape is so dynamic and the way applications are being built is so fluid nowadays that the successful developers are those that have an open mind to all the technologies available to them and can pick the one that's best used for a particular requirement, even if it's just a subset of their application. What I believe that's often going to mean is when you're near the data, SQL is going to be the skill set you're going to want to be using. Does that preclude an ORM? No, but I think ORMs are not the replacement. They are simply something that augments our existing data processing facilities. And rest assured, I know it's a lot easier to speak about being flexible with the skill sets you have than it is to actually do it. I have a natural bias towards SQL because it's what I've been using and more familiar with for many years. And so often I'll build something with a SQL solution that perhaps could have been better suited with a different piece of technology. However, I think it's the opposite that's much more prevalent nowadays. People shying away from SQL because they're a little bit scared about it because they're not familiar with it. And I think that's a shame. So if you're going to be a successful developer, my personal view is it is adopting that mindset of being always flexible. Yes, you might be familiar with an ORM more than anything else, and use that to your advantage. But that doesn't mean you should throw SQL away. Your SQL knowledge will stand you in a very good stead for building applications in the long run as the complexity gets more and more. Because let's face it, it's a jungle out there. Anyway, a little bit of a difference for today's video. We'll be back to our normal scheduled programming tomorrow.